Apple has one of the most scrutinized supply chains on the planet. For years, the signal was unambiguous. Chinese memory doesn't qualify. Then, according to reports, a CXMT dynamic random access memory sample reportedly showed up in an Apple qualification lab, including a bonded architecture that Apple's team was apparently willing to evaluate. That is the kind of thing that is not supposed to happen. Before you read this as Apple caving to cost pressure, or as a political reversal, neither of those explanations fits the timing. The scrutiny on Apple's China exposure has not eased. Apple's memory margins have not collapsed. Something else moved. And that something is the chip itself. Here's what makes this worth paying attention to. If CXMT can clear Apple's technical threshold, even in a test, it doesn't need to win the contract. It just needs to exist on that bench. Because what sits on that bench sets the price Samsung and SK Hynix charge for everything else. That is the floor CXMT raises. And the floor is what this story is really about. By the end, you'll understand what CXMT actually built, why Apple's test is about leverage rather than loyalty, and what it means for Korean dominance of premium dynamic random access memory. 3 open questions to carry through. What is the bonded architecture CXMT reportedly built, and why does it matter for Apple specifically? How did CXMT close a gap that was once described as a decade wide, without access to the tools everyone assumed were required? And what actually stands between a test sample and a purchase order? All 3 answers are coming. But first, the market that made this necessary. Samsung and SK Hynix collectively dominate the supply of high-performance dynamic random access memory for Apple's flagship devices. That is not a recent development. It is a structural condition that has held for years. Apple's procurement strategy is built around maintaining competition between suppliers. The company qualifies multiple sources wherever it can, across components from displays to wireless chips to storage, precisely because a single-source relationship gives that supplier unchecked pricing power. In dynamic random access memory, for the kind of high-bandwidth, low-power chips that Apple's flagship devices require, the realistic alternative to Samsung and SK Hynix has simply not existed. Not at the quality bar, not at the volume Apple needs, not at the reliability standard Apple's production process demands. Think of it like a 2-lane bridge into a city. If both lanes are owned by the same operator, they set the toll. A third lane does not have to carry traffic to lower the price. It just has to be buildable. For most of the last decade, a credible third lane in premium dynamic random access memory was not buildable. CXMT, China's largest dynamic random access memory maker, holding approximately 8% of global market share by analyst estimates, was not in the conversation for Apple's qualification process. The gap in process sophistication, in yield reliability, in supply scale was simply too wide. So the question was always, when would a Chinese dynamic random access memory maker get good enough to sit on Apple's bench? The answer required solving a problem that everyone assumed required tools China does not have. CXMT reportedly runs a bonded dynamic random access memory test line. That architecture matters, so here is what it actually means. Traditional dynamic random access memory scaling works horizontally. You shrink the features on a chip to pack in more memory cells at higher density and bandwidth. That shrinking depends on lithography equipment. The most advanced version of that equipment, extreme ultraviolet scanners from ASML, is export controlled. CXMT does not have access to leading-edge extreme ultraviolet tools. That is an established fact from the export control record. What CXMT reportedly did instead is stack and bond dies vertically, connecting separate layers of memory with extremely dense interconnects, achieving bandwidth and density gains that a single chip on a mature process node could not deliver alone. Think of it like building a taller structure instead of a wider footprint. If you cannot expand horizontally, Because the most advanced land clearing equipment is restricted, you stack vertically. The size of each floor matters less when you have enough floors connected tightly enough. This is not a speculative approach. High bandwidth memory, which ships in enormous volumes inside data center chips and is an established part of the industry, uses a related stacking principle. The specific bonded line CXMT is reported to be running as unconfirmed at production volume. It is a reported test line, not a verified mass production capability. But the architectural logic is real, and it is the mechanism by which CXMT partially decouples its performance trajectory from its lithography ceiling. That pays off the first open question. The bonded architecture is how a company operating on older lithography tools gets a sample onto a premium qualification bench, which brings us to the gap and how fast it is closing. The distance between CXMT and the Korean leaders is reported to be roughly 3 years, according to analyst estimates. That number deserves context. What analysts once described as a gap of a decade or more has compressed to roughly 3 years. Without access to ASML's most advanced extreme ultraviolet tools, CXMT closed that distance through process refinement on older deep ultraviolet equipment, through design iteration, and through architectural moves like vertical die bonding rather than raw lithography advancement. Analyst estimates, it is worth being clear, are estimates. The precise figure is not an independently audited measurement, but the directional shift from a gap so wide that Chinese dynamic random access memory was not a topic Apple's procurement team needed to consider, to a gap close enough that a sample reportedly reached Apple's lab, is the shift that matters. 3 years still sounds like a lot. For most suppliers, it is. For Apple's procurement team, 3 years is close enough to test, because the test is not about winning the next iPhone production cycle. It is about changing the negotiation in the current one. That closes the second open question. CXMT narrowed the gap, not by acquiring tools it was denied, but by building around the constraint. And that is the mechanism the headline misses entirely. Apple does not need to buy a single CXMT chip for this test to accomplish something. The logic follows directly from how Apple's procurement actually works. When a new supplier clears the qualification bar, or even credibly approaches it, the dynamic shifts. Samsung and SK Hynix are not naive. They know Apple's team does not place suppliers on evaluation benches as a public relations exercise. If CXMT is reportedly being evaluated, that evaluation is credible enough to negotiate against. The floor rises under Korean pricing power, not because Apple switches, but because Apple could. A third lane on a bridge does not need to carry a single car to lower the toll the existing operators can charge. It just needs to be open for traffic. CXMT's reported appearance on Apple's test bench is the ribbon cutting on that lane. Samsung and SK Hynix know a full switch is unlikely. The political exposure alone makes a public volume commitment to a Chinese dynamic random access memory supplier a significant risk for Apple. But they also know Apple's procurement team does not bluff. Credible is all leverage requires, which makes the honest question not, will Apple buy CXMT chips, but what actually stands between the test and a purchase order. Here is where the evidence runs out, and it is worth being precise about that. A qualification test and a supply agreement are separated by yield, by reliability at Apple's volumes, and by supply security. Apple's volumes for a flagship memory component are enormous, tens of millions of units per quarter. CXMT holds approximately 8% of the global dynamic random access memory market by analyst estimate. Its production capacity, even if technically qualified, has not been demonstrated against a single customer at Apple's scale. No public evidence exists of CXMT's yield rates on the reported bonded line. No public evidence exists of Apple's internal qualification status, whether CXMT has cleared any specific technical threshold or is still in early evaluation. And the political environment, while not moving fast enough to kill a test, is not stable enough to make a public volume commitment risk-free for Apple. Passing a driving test does not mean you are ready for a cross-country delivery route in a storm. The test proves the fundamentals. The route requires a different standard of proof, and that proof has not been demonstrated publicly. That closes the third open question. Qualifying is not buying. The gap between the bench and the bill of materials is real. Here is my honest read. The triumphalist version, China just cracked Apple's supply chain, outruns the evidence by a significant margin. A reported test line and a reported consideration are not a supply agreement. But the dismissive version, this is just a test, nothing to see, Samsung and SK Hynix are untouchable, misses what a test at Apple's level actually signals. Apple does not evaluate suppliers as a courtesy. When something lands on that bench, it is because something in its capability crossed a threshold. My read, this is leverage in action. CXMT does not need to win to change the game. It needs to be credible. And credible, right now, it apparently is. Every time CXMT clears a new threshold, a test bench, a process node, a qualification step, the floor rises. Samsung and SK Hynix do not lose a contract. They lose a fraction of the certainty that their pricing power rests on. That is the story. Not a vow broken, a floor raised. Apple did not reverse course because the politics got easier or the prices got irresistible. The vow became obsolete because the chip got good enough to matter as a threat. So here is what I want your honest read on in the comments. Does getting on Apple's test bench matter more than landing the purchase order? Or is a test without a contract ultimately just noise that Samsung and SK Hynix can absorb? Two genuinely defensible answers. Tell me which one you believe and why. Subscribe if you want to follow whether this test becomes a contract, whether CXMT clears the volume bar, and what it means for Korean dynamic random access memory pricing when the floor keeps rising. Apple did not break a vow. The floor moved.